October 14, 1943. High over the German city of Schweinfurt, the United States 8th Air Force is being systematically dismantled. Their P-47 escorts, starved of fuel, have already turned back for England. Now, deep inside enemy territory, unescorted B-17 face waves of seasoned Luftwaffe fighters. In a matter of hours, 60 heavy bombers fall from the sky. Over 600 American airmen are lost. The fundamental military doctrine that heavily armed bomber formations could defend themselves has catastrophically collapsed, bringing the strategic bombing campaign to a dead halt. Commanders now face an impossible reality: find a way to survive deep over Germany or abandon daylight bombing entirely. The slaughter over Schweinfurt forced a brutal reckoning within the Allied High Command. What followed was one of the most desperate tactical shifts of the Second World War. Popular mythology often dictates that the arrival of a single aircraft, the North American P-51 Mustang, magically saved the 8th Air Force and won the skies over Europe. But the historical reality is far more complex and far more lethal. This turnaround was not just about rolling out a new machine. It required a massive systemic overhaul of military leadership, industrial logistics, and a ruthless change in combat philosophy. How exactly did the Allies transform a paralyzing, suicidal escort crisis into a campaign of absolute aerial dominance? How did they break the back of the veteran Luftwaffe, moving beyond the passive defense of heavy bombers to execute a cold, calculated strategy of total attrition? The answer involves command purchase, mechanical gambles, and forcing an experienced enemy into an inescapable war of numbers. But to comprehend how the Allies engineered this resurrection, we first have to examine the fatally flawed doctrine that put them there in the first place, and understand exactly why the Americans were bleeding out over Germany. To understand the fatal trap the United States 8th Air Force flew into during the autumn of 1943, we must look at the geography of the European Air War and the stark limitations of American technology at the time. The pre-war doctrine relied heavily on the concept of the self-defending bomber formation. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator were bristling with 50 caliber machine guns. Planners believed that tight, mutually supporting formations, the combat box, could generate enough overlapping crossfire to fight their way to any target in Germany and back. Over Schweinfurt, that theory was violently dismantled. Escort fighters were available to protect these bomber streams, but they were tethered by the severe limits of internal fuel capacity. The primary American fighter in the European theater was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It was a massive, rugged machine, heavily armed, highly survivable, and lethal in a dive. But powered by a giant radial engine, it consumed high-octane aviation fuel at an astonishing rate. In combat conditions, maneuvering and engaging at high throttle, its range was severely restricted. Even with the introduction of early drop tanks, the Thunderbolt simply did not have the legs to follow the heavy bombers deep into the Reich. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine fighter with a much longer potential range, was theoretically supposed to fill this void. However, in late 1943, the Lightning struggled in the freezing, high-altitude environment of Northern Europe. Its engines suffered from frequent failures in the extreme cold. Cockpit heating was inadequate, and the supply of P-38s was stretched incredibly thin across multiple theaters of war. They were not available in the mass numbers required to shield the vast bomber streams. This technological limitation created an invisible, lethal boundary in the sky over Europe. On any given mission into the German industrial heartland, the 8th Air Force bombers would launch from England, assemble over the Channel, and push inland. The P-47 escorts would weave above them, burning precious fuel just to maintain position with the slower, heavy bombers. But right as the Armada approached the German border, roughly along the line of the Rhine River, the fighter pilots had to check their gauges. The mathematics of aviation fuel were unforgiving. They had just enough gas to return to base. Wagging their wings in a grim farewell, the American fighters banked away, leaving the bombers completely exposed. The German High Command understood this geographical and technological trap perfectly. Operating from their home turf, the Luftwaffe possessed a highly integrated defense network. Ground controllers utilized sophisticated early warning radars to track the massive American formations the moment they formed up over the English coast. They did not need to scramble their interceptors immediately. Instead, German commanders played a terrifying waiting game. They conserved their fuel and positioned their squadrons strategically, massing their forces inland. They knew exactly where the American fighter escorts would reach their point of no return. As soon as the Thunderbolts turned for home, the German controllers unleashed their veteran fighter squadrons. Hundreds of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf-09s, often armed with heavy 20mm cannons and underwing rockets, swarmed the unescorted bombers. The Luftwaffe pilots were highly experienced, and they held a massive logistical advantage. They were fighting in their own airspace. If a German fighter was shot down and the pilot successfully bailed out, he would parachute into a local field, catch a train, and often be back in a new cockpit the very next day. If an American bomber crew went down, even if they survived the bailout, they became prisoners of war. Every single loss for the 8th Air Force was permanent. By late 1943, this dynamic created a mathematically unsustainable slaughter. During deep penetration raids, the 8th Air Force was suffering loss rates approaching 10% per mission. An American bomber crewman was required to complete 25 combat missions to earn a ticket home. Statistically, surviving a full tour had become a mathematical impossibility. The crews knew it, and the commanders knew it. The pressure on the Allied High Command was crushing. This was not just a localized tactical crisis. It threatened the entire strategic timetable of the war. The combined chiefs of staff were rapidly preparing for Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of France. The absolute prerequisite for a successful amphibious landing was total air superiority. If the Luftwaffe remained a cohesive, lethal force by the summer of 1944, German dive bombers and strafing fighters would turn the invasion beaches into a massacre. The 8th Air Force had to destroy the German aviation industry and break the Luftwaffe in the air, but they could not achieve this if their bombers were being annihilated before they even reached their targets. It was a brutal equation of time versus blood. The American command faced an impossible dilemma: either find a fighter capable of escorting the heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back, or abandon daylight strategic bombing entirely, jeopardizing the impending invasion of Europe. The entire Allied war machine was backed into a corner, waiting for an answer, until a specific, unexpected technological marriage offered a sudden lifeline. That lifeline arrived not from a completely new design, but from a desperate, brilliant act of engineering cross-pollination. The North American P-51 Mustang had been flying for a few years, but its early models were plagued by a fatal flaw. The American Allison engine was starved for oxygen at high altitudes, making it practically useless for the freezing thin air where the heavy bombers operated. The turning point came when engineers decided to rip out the Allison and replace it with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same legendary power plant used in the Supermarine Spitfire. This technological marriage fundamentally altered the physics of the air war. The Merlin gave the Mustang exceptional high-altitude performance, while the aircraft's uniquely smooth laminar flow wing drastically reduced drag. When engineers figured out how to wedge an additional 85-gallon fuel tank right behind the pilot's seat, the math suddenly changed. The Mustang could now fly from England, escort the B-17s all the way to Berlin, fight at 30,000 feet, and fly back. But having the right machine was only half the equation. The true turning point was how that machine was deployed. In January 1944, a massive command shakeup brought Major General Jimmy Doolittle, the famous architect of the Tokyo raid, into command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle looked at the horrific bomber losses and realized the fundamental flaw in American tactical thinking. Under previous commanders, fighter pilots had been strictly ordered to stay close to the bombers, acting as a passive shield. They were forbidden from breaking formation to chase German interceptors, ensuring they remained in a defensive posture. Doolittle immediately and controversially shredded that rulebook. He walked into a briefing room and famously ordered his fighter commanders to take down the signs that read, "Defend the bombers." He replaced them with a new directive, "Destroy the enemy." Doolittle unleashed his fighters. Instead of flying slow, fuel-wasting weaves above the bombers, Mustang and Thunderbolt squadrons were ordered to push miles ahead of the bomber streams. They were no longer bodyguards, they were hunters. If they saw German fighters forming up in the distance, they were commanded to drop their external fuel tanks, hit maximum throttle, and attack the Luftwaffe before they could even get near the heavy bombers. This single aggressive shift in doctrine was a shockwave through the theater. It transformed the long-range fighter from a defensive escort into an apex predator, stripping the Luftwaffe of its ability to choose when and where to fight. The American fighters were now actively seeking combat, setting the stage for a violent, bloody escalation that would tear the skies apart in the spring of 1944. The execution of this new, hyper-aggressive doctrine began not with a single cinematic battle, but with a relentless, mathematically calculated shift in daily operations throughout the late winter and early spring of 1944. The 8th Air Force did not simply launch masses of Mustangs and tell them to find the enemy. Instead, they engineered a highly synchronized system of layered airspace, utilizing the specific strengths of their entire fighter inventory. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, now equipped with enlarged, pressurized external drop tanks, took the bombers across the English Channel and pushed deep over the continent, utilizing their massive firepower and unmatched dive speeds to shatter the initial waves of coastal interceptors. As the Thunderbolts reached their fuel limits and banked away, squadrons of twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, waiting at precise rendezvous coordinates, took the baton. Finally, deep over the German heartland, the P-51 Mustangs materialized, taking over the most dangerous, highly contested airspace directly surrounding the targets. This relay system required flawless navigation and timing. If a fighter group missed a rendezvous point in the heavy European cloud cover by just 3 minutes, the bomber stream would be naked and exposed. For the American fighter pilot, a deep penetration escort was a test of absolute physical and psychological endurance. Strapped into the cramped cockpit of a Mustang, sitting on a dinghy and a parachute, a pilot faced missions lasting 6 to 7 hours. At 30,000 feet, the outside air temperature routinely plunged to 40 degrees below zero. The pilot breathed through a rubber oxygen mask that constantly filled with freezing condensation, while the immense vibration of the 1,600 horsepower Merlin engine hummed endlessly through the airframe. It was hours of freezing, exhausting boredom, defined by the constant, agonizing swivel of the head, scanning the glaring sun and the vast, empty blue for a tiny black speck that could mean an incoming fighter. But when the enemy was spotted, the transition from boredom to extreme violence was instantaneous. Under the new doctrine, upon sighting a German formation forming up in the distance, American flight leaders gave the order to drop external tanks. The sky would fill with tumbling aluminum as the fighters shed their heavy fuel pods, hit maximum throttle, and surged forward. This aggressive forward sweep completely dismantled the Luftwaffe's established defensive architecture. Previously, the German strategy relied heavily on specialized bomber-destroyer units. They utilized heavy twin-engine aircraft like the Messerschmitt 110 or the Me 410, which were equipped with underwing rockets. These heavy fighters would loiter safely outside the range of the bomber's defensive machine guns, launch their rockets into the combat box to break the formation, and then let heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190s, outfitted with bolt-on steel plating and thick armored glass, close in to slaughter the scattered stragglers. It had been a highly effective, methodical system of destruction, but these heavy, armor-laden German interceptors were slow and sluggish. When Mustangs and Thunderbolts were unleashed miles ahead of the bombers, these specialized bomber killers suddenly found themselves intercepted before they could even align their attack runs. The hunters immediately became the hunted. The heavy German interceptors were cut to pieces, forcing the Luftwaffe to detach its own agile Messerschmitt 109s just to protect their bomber destroyers from the roaming Americans. The most ruthless evolution of this new doctrine, however, did not happen at 30,000 feet. It happened right on the deck. Returning from high-altitude sweeps, or utilizing whatever fuel they had left after the bombers had dropped their payloads, American fighters were authorized to drop down to treetop level and hunt. They swept over the European landscape at 400 miles per hour, looking for targets of opportunity, primarily focusing on Luftwaffe airfields. This was a brutally dangerous tactic. At low altitude, the vaunted Mustang was highly vulnerable to ground fire. Unlike the radial engine of the Thunderbolt, which could take massive physical damage and keep running, the Mustang's Merlin engine was liquid-cooled. A single stray bullet from a German infantryman's rifle or a piece of shrapnel piercing the radiator under the fuselage would drain the coolant. Within minutes, the engine would seize, turning the sleek fighter into a heavily armed glider and trapping the pilot deep in hostile territory. The German airfields were heavily defended by rings of deadly rapid-fire light anti-aircraft guns, particularly the dreaded quad 20mm Flak Vierling. Yet, the strategic math of the attrition war demanded the risk. Destroying a German fighter while it was taxiing, refueling, or taking off meant one less machine and critically, one less pilot to intercept the bombers the next day. The American fighter sweeps turned German airfields into graveyards of burning aluminum, catching the enemy in their most vulnerable state. Down in the concrete bunkers of the German command centers, inside the plotting rooms of the Jagd divisions, a chilling new reality materialized on the illuminated map tables. For years, the sophisticated German radar network had tracked the massive, predictable bomber streams, allowing controllers to carefully marshal their forces and choose the exact time and place of the intercept. They had always known the geographical boundaries where the American escorts would be forced by the laws of physics to turn back. But in the spring of 1944, the radar plots didn't turn around. The blips representing single-engine fighters just kept coming. They pushed past the Ruhr Valley, they pushed past Hanover, and eventually they pushed all the way to the capital. In early March 1944, the appearance of American fighters in the airspace directly over Berlin sent a wave of psychological shock through the German high command. The ultimate sanctuary had been breached. The Luftwaffe could no longer form up in massive, unmolested formations behind the lines, because there were no longer any lines. The entire airspace of the Third Reich had become a contested combat zone. To stem this overwhelming tide, the Luftwaffe was forced into a desperate, cannibalistic escalation. They needed experienced combat leaders in the air to counter the massive American fighter sweeps. And to get them, they were forced to commit their most valuable, irreplaceable human assets: flight instructors. Highly decorated veterans of the Spanish Civil War and the Battle of Britain, who had been pulled back from the front to train the next generation, were suddenly ordered into the cockpits of interceptors and thrown into the meat grinder. These were the men holding the entire German training infrastructure together, and now they were dying in the skies over their own airfields. The compounding effect of losing these veteran flight leaders was catastrophic. A fighter squadron relies on the situational awareness and tactical intuition of its veteran commanders to guide the newer pilots, to know when to dive, when to brake, and when to run. As these experienced commanders were systematically hunted down and killed by the roaming Mustangs and Thunderbolts, the squadrons were left rudderless, led by men who had only survived a few weeks longer than the raw recruits following them. This collapse of human capital occurred alongside a strange, often misunderstood industrial paradox. From a purely manufacturing standpoint, the German aviation sector in the spring of 1944 was performing logistical miracles. Under the direction of Albert Speer and the Ministry of Armaments, aircraft production was decentralized, moved into hidden facilities, tunnels, and dispersed forests to protect it from the bombing. Despite the relentless pounding of German cities, German factories were churning out Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s in absolute record numbers. Trainloads of brand new, highly capable fighter aircraft were constantly arriving at forward airfields. The German war machine was not running out of planes. It was running out of the men required to fly them. A high-performance fighter aircraft is a finely tuned instrument of war, but without a properly trained pilot, it is merely an aluminum coffin. The disparity in the training pipelines between the two warring powers had become a chasm. The United States possessed a massive, undisturbed training machine, benefiting from the vast, secure skies of Texas, Arizona, and California, and fueled by an unlimited supply of high-octane aviation gas. An American pilot arrived at a combat squadron in England as a highly polished product. He had progressed from primary trainers to advanced trainers, spent hours in aerial gunnery schools, and mastered complex navigation over endless safe terrain. He arrived at the front with upwards of 300 hours of total flight time. In stark contrast, the German replacement system was completely collapsing under the pressure of the attrition. Because of the constant need for bodies at the front, and due to growing constraints on aviation fuel for training units, German novices were rushed through the curriculum. They were often sent to frontline combat squadrons with barely 100 hours of total flight time. In many cases, these young men had spent less than 20 hours in the actual high-performance fighter type they were expected to take into combat. They had barely mastered the complicated torque of takeoff and the high-speed dynamics of landing, let alone the intricate geometry of aerial deflection shooting or extreme evasive maneuvering. The visceral reality for a German novice entering the air war in 1944 was one of absolute terror and brutal brevity. Taking off into a sky dominated by hundreds of roaming American fighters, these undertrained teenagers were thrown into massive, swirling furballs involving hundreds of aircraft moving at extreme speeds. In the chaotic, three-dimensional geometry of a dogfight, situational awareness is the only currency that matters. The novices simply could not process the overwhelming sensory input fast enough. They would lose their flight leaders in the clouds, panic, break formation, and instantly become targets. In the brutal mathematics of the spring offensive, a massive percentage of these replacement pilots were shot down and killed within their first 3 combat missions, often without ever seeing the Mustang or Thunderbolt that fired the fatal burst. The surviving German veterans, the famous Experten, who had accumulated dozens or hundreds of kills, fought on with lethal skill, but they were exhausted, flying multiple sorties a day, watching their squadrons fill with unfamiliar faces who would be gone by the end of the week. The dynamics in the air had fundamentally shifted. The vast geography of the European theater had transformed into a relentless American hunting ground. The 8th Air Force fighters were no longer fighting a desperate rearguard action to protect a specific box of bombers. They were utilizing their immense range and numbers to execute a strategy of total, suffocating air supremacy. They swept the skies ahead of the bomber streams. They lingered over the targets, and they hunted on the long flight back to the English Channel. They strafed locomotives, shot up river barges, and attacked enemy transport columns on the roads. For the German pilots, the conflict had devolved into a defensive, losing battle for sheer survival. The luxury of climbing to high altitude, assembling massive, coordinated formations, and choosing the perfect angle of attack was gone forever. They were fighting just to get off the ground, fighting to form up, and fighting to survive the intercept. By the late spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was bleeding to death in its own airspace. The Mustang, supported by the Thunderbolt and the Lightning, had successfully broken the back of the German fighter force, transforming a paralyzed strategic bombing campaign into an instrument of absolute aerial dominance. They had become the sharp end of the Allied spear, a lethal, highly visible weapon that pierced the heart of the Third Reich. But a spear does not penetrate heavy armor on the sharpness of its blade alone. The immense, crushing weight driving that blade deeper and deeper into Germany, paralyzing the enemy's ability to respond, came from a less visible, far more crippling campaign. That crushing weight was a relentless war on logistics, dismantling the enduring post-war myth that the P-51 Mustang alone won the skies over Europe. The Mustang was a magnificent machine, but reducing the Allied victory to a simple story of superior aerodynamics ignores the grim reality of industrial warfare. The American fighter was merely the executioner. The true death blow was being dealt directly to the German economy. In May 1944, the Allied air forces initiated a highly concentrated, systematic bombing campaign against Germany's synthetic oil plants, massive, sprawling industrial complexes like Leuna and Politz that chemically converted coal into aviation gas. The results were catastrophic for the Third Reich. Within weeks, German aviation fuel production plummeted by over 90%. This created a paralyzing ripple effect across the entire Luftwaffe. It was not just a lack of volume. It was a severe drop in quality. High-performance interceptors required high-octane fuel to achieve their maximum speed, climb rate, and altitude. Instead, German ground crews were forced to pump inferior, low-grade synthetic blends into the tanks, instantly degrading the combat performance of their own fighters before the wheels even left the runway. Crucially, this fuel drought shattered whatever remained of the German training infrastructure. While American pilots burned millions of gallons of high-octane gas over the United States to perfect their aerial gunnery, the Luftwaffe was forced to ground its training squadrons. Flight schools were starved of fuel. Instructors could no longer afford to let students practice complex maneuvers in the air. Novice pilots were taught combat theory on the ground, given a dangerously inadequate handful of actual flying hours, and then pushed straight to the front lines. The victory over the Luftwaffe was not a romantic duel of knights in the sky. It was secured by methodically grinding down the enemy's industrial lifeblood and educational foundation. The technological advantage of the Mustang was undeniably vital, but its dominance was magnified exponentially by this systemic, engineered collapse of the German war machine, setting the stage for the decisive blow. This convergence of industrial strangulation and tactical aggression reached its violent climax between February 20th and 25th, 1944. A six-day offensive codenamed Operation Argument, remembered by the crews simply as Big Week. The 8th Air Force launched thousands of heavy bombers against the core of Germany's aircraft manufacturing infrastructure. The German High Command had no choice but to respond. To protect their assembly plants, Luftwaffe controllers ordered every available interceptor into the sky, massing their forces for a decisive counterblow. But as the German squadrons climbed through the freezing winter clouds, expecting to find the unprotected bomber streams of the previous autumn, they flew directly into Doolittle's meat grinder. Instead of vulnerable targets, they were met by aggressive sweeps of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings, attacking miles ahead of the formations. The resulting aerial battles were not defensive skirmishes. They were campaigns of total annihilation. The relentless pressure reached its absolute apex less than 2 weeks later, when the 8th Air Force directed its armadas toward the ultimate sanctuary, Berlin. On March 6th and again on March 8th, hundreds of American heavy bombers, shielded all the way to the target and back by long-range fighters, appeared over the German capital. Hermann Göring had once famously boasted that enemy bombs would never fall on Berlin. Now the skies above his headquarters were filled with the roar of American engines. In a desperate bid to defend the capital and salvage the regime's prestige, the Luftwaffe committed its last remaining operational reserves. The veteran flight commanders, squadron leaders, and surviving instructors who had been hastily pushed into frontline cockpits were thrown into massive, swirling dogfights over the city. In the freezing airspace above Berlin, the Luftwaffe suffered an irreplaceable hemorrhage of human capital. Over those crucial weeks in the spring of 1944, Germany lost hundreds of its most experienced fighter pilots, the indispensable veterans who held the squadrons together and possessed the tactical intuition to lead in combat. Aircraft factories could replace the shredded aluminum, but the German training pipeline could never replace the seasoned flight leaders dying over their own capital. By the end of March, the spine of the German fighter force was permanently broken. The Luftwaffe was stripped of its capacity to mount a coordinated, theater-wide defense. When the Allied invasion armada finally approached the beaches of Normandy on the morning of June 6th, the once terrifying air arm that had conquered Europe was virtually absent from the skies, leaving the invasion beaches beneath an umbrella of absolute Allied air supremacy. The stark contrast between the autumn of 1943 and the summer of 1944 defines the true nature of the American air war in Europe. Back in October, during the disaster over Schweinfurt, the Allied command had learned a bitter, bloody lesson. Courage and hundreds of heavy machine guns were not enough. Sending bomber crews deep into enemy territory without the right technology and a sound tactical doctrine was not a strategy. It was a death sentence. The bombers had been systematically slaughtered precisely because they had operated under a rigid, flawed concept of self-defense, leaving them isolated and exposed at the exact moment they were most vulnerable. But less than a year later, the strategic landscape had been completely inverted. American heavy bombers were now capable of striking virtually anywhere within the borders of the Third Reich. They were not invincible, and planes still fell, but the deadly gauntlet they had once faced was gone. The skies over Germany had been methodically and ruthlessly cleared of their defenders. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang, with its Merlin engine and immense range, was the vital technological key that unlocked this capability. But the ultimate triumph of the 8th Air Force was not secured by an airplane alone. It was the result of a complex, brutal equation. It required aggressive command decisions that transformed defensive escorts into roaming hunters. It required overwhelming logistical supremacy, producing thousands of fighters and the high-octane fuel to fly them. And critically, it required the systematic, industrial strangulation of the German war machine, starving the Luftwaffe of fuel and forcing an irreplaceable generation of veteran pilots into a war of attrition they could not win. The sky was not won through simple heroics. It was conquered through cold, calculated exhaustion. The Allied strategic bombing offensive ultimately succeeded not merely by surviving the Luftwaffe, but by deliberately forcing its fighters into the sky to be hunted down and destroyed. In the brutal calculation of total war, the sky over Europe was decisively conquered the very moment the heavy bomber fleets were turned into bait.